Hi, welcome to Videos from the Ville. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, professor of government and political affairs, and this is city planning. On this particular video, we're going to take a look at land use and land use studies. We're working towards tackling one of our large textbooks in our next video offering, Design with Nature with Ian McHarg, and this will help prepare us for that. Well, as we look at land use and land use studies, we find that there has been a movement, there was a movement building in the United States, particularly in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, to try to determine really how much land do we have, what's it being used for, how much land are we going to need in the future. And we find that one of the groups that had been involved with that was called Resources for the Future. Resources for the Future had projected that between 1960 and 2000, the amount of land that was required for urban areas in the United States would double. And it would double from 21,400,000 acres to 45 million acres. We find that you can follow along with this, again, if you have your PowerPoints with you. You have your PowerPoints by you, and this will be very easy to follow. You find that land use studies are designed to present the basic data on land characteristics and the various activities that occupy the land in the area that we're interested in. So a land use study provides the basic information needed to draw up, needed to formulate a long-range land use plan. And one of the ways that you go about doing this is through land use surveys. Land use surveys are done by car or by foot in areas that have a lot of mixed land usage. One of the first things we have to do is classify our land usages. So classification of land use. This is very necessary for a land use survey, just as it is when we get to economic-based studies. And one of the things we use to do this is called the Standard Land Use Coding Manual. The Standard Land Use Coding Manual. The Standard Land Use Coding Manual was originally put out by the U.S. Urban Renewal Administration and by the Bureau of Public Records. This manual offers 4-digit categories. The 4-digit categories are just like the economic-based study classifications. The level of specificity will increase with every digit added. In other words, you'll have digits that will indicate this is occupied land, this is vacant land, this is land that's used for industrial use. And then the next digit might indicate if it's heavy industrial use or light or moderate industrial use. And the next digit might indicate the exact type of usage, that it's being used as a factory, it's being used as a warehouse, whatever the case may be. Okay, but you'll have this 4-digit categories and categorization that is used by the Standard Land Use Coding Manual. Find that this tries to bring uniformity to the collection, to the storage, and to the sharing or the dissemination of land use information to make it more valuable and to make it easier to analyze for all interested researchers and governments who might be taking a look at this at these pieces of land. Now, one of the things that we have to tackle in this area is also forecasting space requirements. We want to try to come up with reasonable estimates of future space requirements for every category of land that's in a study. We find that then these estimates can be used in the preparation of land use plans. So we want to be able to predict for the future how much land is going to be used in agriculture, how much land is going to be used in residential areas, how much land is going to be used for recreation, and so forth. And then we can put those in our land use plan. What are our estimates going to be based on? Well, our estimates will be based on what is there currently. We'll look at the current space requirements and we'll modify them. We will tweak them by our forecasts for population growth or population loss. Those estimates will be also be based on economic activity projections. How much economic activity is projected to occur here over time. We'll also tweak them for the legal requirements that are prevailing for that land, such as zoning. What are the legal requirements for zoning? What are the legal requirements for housing? What are the legal requirements for subdivision codes? Find that we also want to tweak these estimates based on changes in technology that could affect how much space the different industries will need. Okay? So changes in technology that could affect space for industry is the last thing that these estimates are based on as we engage in forecasting space requirements. Well, under forecasting space requirements, we also find that space requirements are estimated for the following types of land. What kind of land are we interested in, and how much land do we need across the board for a whole variety of different usages? One would be industrial land. We find that the city planner Shirley Wise wants not only to know how much industrial land we're going to need, but she believes that an industrial reserve should be set aside, and this industrial reserve would be for large, unforeseen, unexpected industrial enterprises. This might be similar to what we find happening in Lebanon County right now in South Annville Township. South Annville Township really didn't expect to be approached by Hershey Foods, who want to build a warehouse facility that is going to be the size of 5 Walmarts put together. That was a bolt from the blue, very unexpected. So this would mesh very nicely with this warning that Shirley Wise sets out for us, that we should have a industrial land reserve in addition to the land that we're forecasting that'll be needed for the future for different purposes, but in this case we're talking about industry. So space requirements are needed for industrial land, number 1. Number 2, for wholesale land. Number 3, for commercial land. Number 4, for government facility land. Number 5 will be land that's necessary to contain the community's infrastructure. The infrastructure being communications, utilities, transportation. Well, as we look at these various needs, let's take a look at residential use space requirements as we forecast them. The amount of land that we need for residential use will be dependent upon 3 things that immediately come to mind. One is, what is the rate at which new families are being formed in your area? The rate of new family formation in your area. Number 2, the rate of in-migration. Rate of in-migration, how many people are moving to your area. Number 3, what is going to be the effect of housing codes, of slum clearance, and of private demolition? What is the effect of housing codes, slum clearance, and private demolition on the supply of dwelling units. Well, the biggest and most important question as we work towards preparing a land use plan are, do the various elements of the land use plan fit together? Do the various elements of the land use plan fit together? Are the plans for future land use, for transportation networks, for open space, are all those logical? And are they in accordance, for example, with Ian McCard's ecological planning method that we're going to study in the near future as we tackle the textbook Design with Nature? We'll get into that in great detail. Well, what are some of the other issues that we deal with when we take a look at a land use plan? Number one, when we're looking at formulating land use plans, for example, for a county, does the plan address the community's major problems? So number one, does the plan address the community's major problems? Number two, can the community afford the improvements that were visualized by the plan? Can the community afford the improvements that the plan believes we're going to see? Number three, have both public and private interests been given full consideration? Number four, did we have sufficient levels of citizen participation? Did we have appropriate and sufficient levels of citizen participation in the formulation of the plan? One of the ways that we go about this is through the land use analysis process. And the land use analysis process uses something called the progressive planning approach. The progressive planning approach. The progressive planning approach is a process. It works from very broad forecasts and goals regarding land usage to very specific recommendations. You want to take a look at your PowerPoints on this issue. Of course, one of the things that we're very much concerned about in the topic of land usage is the issue of urban sprawl. This is a prime concern for urban planners, but we do know that some types of urban sprawl are better than others. There are three major types of urban sprawl I want to talk about for a moment. One is continuous low density, the second is scattered development or leapfrog development, and the third is strip or ribbon development. Continuous low density development consists of relatively large, very large lots, single detached homes, and we find that planners haven't been able to agree on the desirability or non-desirability of this type. I think that we're leaning against this type. It is good that they are close to one another, one after the other, but it's taking up a larger amount of land. The scattered development or leapfrog development, here we find we have development occurring beyond an urban area, and we find that then there's vacant land, then we have more development, then there's vacant land, then we have more development. Leapfrog development, planners dislike this type of development and this type of urban sprawl. The third and final type of urban sprawl is ribbon development or strip development, and we find that planners also dislike this. It's development along highways. Strip development is just a development that follows a highway, and planners do dislike this type of urban sprawl. What are the costs of urban sprawl? As we look at it, what are the disadvantages? What are the costs of it? Well, one we find is environmental cost. There are environmental costs to this. Number two are economic costs. The economic costs would be the cost to provide services to all the people who live hither and yon. We have to, of course, provide them with sewage. We have to provide them with lighting. We have to provide them with roads. We have to provide them with police protection, fire protection, and with water. And the costs of providing these services add up. What are some other forms of physical development that we should take a look at? Well, there is another form of development called continuous low-density development. Continuous low-density development with townhouses and apartment buildings. So there we have that continuous low-density development, but we have clustered in it townhouse after townhouse and apartment buildings. We can also look at cluster development. Cluster development can be seen in Reston, Virginia, and maybe some of you are familiar with Reston. In cluster development, the average density is 8 housing units per acre. 8 housing units per acre, and planners like there to be 4 people per unit. So if we have an average density of 8 housing units per acre and 4 people in every unit, this would be a good example of cluster development. Lastly, we have something called PUD. PUD is planned unit development. Planned unit development can be seen very nicely, very well in Columbia, Maryland. Columbia, Maryland, when I was younger, was a cornfield. And then the same planning company and master planner who planned the Inner Harbor at Baltimore, James Rouse, R-O-U-S-E, the Rouse Company were the leaders in planning and building Columbia, Maryland. As I said, they planned and built the Inner Harbor in Baltimore. They did the waterfront in Norfolk, Virginia. I believe they did the waterfront in Jacksonville, Florida as well. But if you haven't been to Columbia, Maryland, it's well worth the trip to see how it's been set up. Here are pictures in your PowerPoint. They're pictures of the town center in Reston, Virginia, and a picture from the air on Columbia, Maryland, when I taught at Ferrum College, and I would take my city planning classes to Baltimore and Columbia, Maryland on an overnight trip. We'd drive up on a Thursday night, for example, and stay at a hotel just outside of Columbia. Go into Columbia in the morning, and generally the city authorities were happy to take us to their visitor center, and they'd show us a film about the planning and the making of Columbia, and then they'd give us a tour. Then from there we went to downtown Baltimore, where we had the same kind of arrangement with the city planning department in Baltimore that would show us around and educate us about the development and the maturation of Baltimore. Well, what are some other forms of physical development? We find that, as we look at the planned unit development, let's focus for a moment just on the PUD, the planned unit development. What do we need to have a planned unit development, as we have in Columbia, Maryland? What do we need to have a planned unit development, just as we find in Columbia, Maryland? Well, number one is we need different types of housing. And we need, in a planned unit development, at least 3 different types of houses. We need 3 different types of housing. 3 different types of housing. We need different types of land use. We need over half of all the area in the development to be open space. So we need different types of housing. Number one, at least 3 different types. Number 2, we need different types of land usage. Number 3, we need over half of the area to be open space. Number 4, we will need some shopping facilities. Number 5, we're going to need an elementary school. Number 6, we need job opportunities and some forms of industry. And number 7, we need different types of land use that intends to attract different types of people. That is always the goal of a planned unit development, a PUD, that you have the different types of residential units, the different types of economic activities, so we have room and a need for different types of people. What's the disadvantage of a PUD? Well, the disadvantage of a PUD is that it would lack industry. It will lack industry. Well, we said that cluster development, a moment ago, we said that cluster development was preferred over traditional urban sprawl. What are the advantages of cluster development when compared with traditional urban sprawl? Well, the advantages of cluster development is that will give us more open space. It will give us more open space, number 1. Number 2, we'll have lower maintenance costs and lower public service delivery costs. Number 3, we find that cluster development will encourage more community pride and more neighboring activity. Number 4, cluster development in comparison to traditional urban sprawl, cluster development will give us much more recreational space as well, much more recreational space. We find that with the cluster development and with the planned unit development, what's true? With a clustering development or cluster development and a planned unit development, you have more variety. More variety, number 1. Number 2, road construction costs are decreased. Road construction costs are decreased. Number 3, there's less impact on the environment because we leave much more of the landscape just the way we found it. We leave it intact. And number 4, you'll find that when you have a cluster development or PUD, that you will generally leave the natural drainage system intact. We'll leave the natural drainage system intact so we don't have to build an artificial drainage system. Well, let's take a look at one of the most famous studies for land use when this type of art was just in its infancy back in the late 50s and the 60s. We had a very in-depth study done of St. Paul, Minneapolis. We find that the St. Paul, Minneapolis land use study was one of the first large city land use studies that had been done in America. It was thorough, it was comprehensive, and it emphasized and focused on the quality of the natural environment. The St. Paul, Minneapolis study found 2 basic problems for the downtown. One was deterioration, and the other was congestion. So the 2 basic problems of the downtown were deterioration and congestion. Well, deterioration can be managed through economic development plans and through urban renewal packages. Congestion, what did they do in St. Paul, Minneapolis to try to deal with congestion? Well, number 1, they tried to separate pedestrians from traffic, and they did that by building a skyway system. You find the 6 blocks in the downtown. They took a 6-block area that demarcated the downtown of St. Paul, Minneapolis, and we find that we built a skyway system, skyways between buildings, so people didn't even have to go onto the street. This was very useful for climate control. In the summer, it was air conditioned. In the winter, it was warmed, it was heated. And you find that what happened around this skyway system is that shops and commercial activities have sprung up all around the skyway system. You found that they also built truck delivery facilities that were underground. So when the trucks wish to deliver their merchandise and to resupply stores, they would be able to go underneath the street, not be seen, and they would do it in the middle of the night. That would reduce pressures on the volume of any kind of traffic at that point as well, even though in the nighttime you're not going to generally have that. We find that they located parking facilities in St. Paul, Minneapolis. They located parking facilities on the fringe of the downtown area. And then they built a huge conveyor belt. And the conveyor belt is a people mover. Conveyor belt is a people mover to bring people from their from the parking to public transit stops. Public transit stops, whether they be light rail or whether they be buses. And lastly, in St. Paul, Minneapolis, they also improved the public transit to the downtown. So they improved the light rail and they improved the buses and took a good hard look at what they needed to do there. I have in your PowerPoints, there's a picture of the St. Paul, Minneapolis Skyway, and you can see a single individual striding across it as cars go underneath him on the street below. Well, let's move on to zoning. Zoning is the way that we implement a land use plan. Once a county, for example, will put together a plan saying this is what we have now in terms of land usage. There's this part of the county is being used for residential purposes. This part of the county is being used for industrial purposes. This part of the county is being used for recreational purposes. Then how do we implement it? Well, we implement a land use plan through zoning. And you find that zoning can set up manufacturing districts. Zoning can set up residential districts. Zoning can set up commercial districts. And in your packet, I have, was one of your slides, a picture from Charlottesville, Virginia. And this is one of the neighborhood commercial districts. Actually, this picture was taken from the old Main Street, the center of town in Charlottesville, which has been transformed from a commercial street to a pedestrian walkway. Now, we also find that when we are looking at our land use plan, we'll have to have a commercial district. And there's different types of commercial districts. We could have a neighborhood commercial district. We can have a suburban commercial district. We can have shopping centers. We can have central business districts. And the central business district would generally serve the whole metropolitan area. So a central business district would serve the whole metropolitan area. It would offer a wide variety of services, and it would allow the greatest density of buildings. We hope to have the greatest density of buildings. We have two different types of manufacturing districts that we can put into place. So manufacturing districts are central manufacturing districts or suburban manufacturing districts. Well, there are dimensional requirements that we need to take into account when we're dealing with the zoning as well. So we have to determine land use, but we also, under our zoning plans, can also specify dimensional requirements. I want you to look very carefully at your PowerPoints on this issue. You find that dimensional requirements are what? Regulations that deal with the size of the lot, the height of the building, and the coverage that the building could have of the lot. Can the building occupy the whole lot? Can it occupy half of it? Can it occupy a quarter of it? Whatever the case may be. What are the purposes of these dimensional requirements? The purposes are to control population density, to ensure that there's sufficient space, light, and privacy. So we have these kind of dimensional requirements to control population density. Number one, to ensure sufficient space, light, and privacy. Number two. Number three, to reduce fire hazards. And number four, to provide recreational space and recreational play areas. Recreational space and play areas. Find that we can also bring some flexibility into our dimensional requirements. We can bring some flexibility in it by talking about or by utilizing floor area ratio requirements. Floor area ratio requirements. Rather than just talking about minimum lot sizes, we can talk about floor area ratio. And the floor area ratio is the relationship between permitted floor space for a building and the size of the lot. So floor area ratio is the relationship between the permitted floor area of a space and the size of the lot. There are a couple examples here, and perhaps you can better understand them when you take a look at your PowerPoints and you look at these drawings very carefully. For example, a floor area ratio of 1. A floor area ratio of 1. On that kind of a requirement, you can do what? If you have a floor area ratio of 1, you build a one-story building on one complete lot. You build a one-story building on one complete lot. Or with a floor area ratio of 1, you can build a two-story building on half of the building lot. You build a two-story building on half of the lot. You can also build a four-story building on a quarter of the lot. You can build a four-story building on a quarter of the lot. If you have a floor area ratio of 0.5, if you have a floor area ratio of 0.5, then you can build what? A one-story building on half of your lot. A one-story building on half of your lot, or a two-story building on a quarter of the lot. A two-story building on a quarter of the lot. And I have a slide in your packet to demonstrate some of these examples that I'm trying to discuss verbally. You can see right in front of you on the slides, and that would be illustration of floor area ratio. Well, for zoning purposes, we find that every county generally, or local governments, will all have zoning hearing boards. Mostly, I should say, local governments. Example, I live in North Anvil Township in Lebanon County, and we have a zoning hearing board, for example. Every jurisdiction there does. They rule on things, they decide on things such as conditional land uses, what you can use your land for. They involve themselves with variances, requests to deviate from that particular requirement earlier. And thirdly, a zoning hearing board hears appeals by citizens who many believe that the zoning officer or building or a building inspector who has committed an error. So the zoning hearing board rules on conditional land uses, what we may or may not be able to do for a period of time, variances, and appeals by citizens who believe that the zoning officer or a building inspector has made a mistake. What are the disadvantages of zoning? The disadvantages of zoning would be, number one, it inhibits urban development. It inhibits development into the future. So therefore, it deprives cities and suburban areas of tax bases. And their tax bases would be much larger without them. Number two, a second disadvantage of zoning is it inhibits residential development. You find that it tends to stop the filtering process. The filtering process is the acquisition of housing by one lower income group after higher income groups become much more abundant in an area, and they will eventually vacate a certain type of area, or they'll abandon it. Another disadvantage of zoning is that it discourages multiple family home developments. It discourages multiple family home developments. And it discourages multiple family home developments because many cities and the suburbs, they all have a bias. They have biases against multiple family homes. And their areas will all underzone. Find that many people object to multiple family homes, if not on anything else other than they object to them on the basis of aesthetics. You find that something else that occurs is by underzoning for apartments in the suburbs, land prices are driven up as we underzone for apartments. It makes land more valuable, much more wanting, I guess. And therefore, land prices go up. Monopolies can be created on the ownership and the development of this land. And as land prices go up, rents increase. As land prices are driven up, land will go away. It'll go away because the prices will be driven up so high and the rents will increase. So what do you find as a result of all that? Well, the results are that moderate and lower income groups are simply squeezed out of an area. Another disadvantage of zoning is, according to some, it tends to be discriminatory, and it tends to be oriented towards the power of one or just a handful of people. So zoning tends to be discriminatory and power-oriented. Number 5, zoning tends to discourage mobile home development. And this may be the only type of home that many of the audience, many of the readers or citizens can afford. So another disadvantage of zoning is it discourages mobile home development, and this will affect lower income groups as well. How do we improve mobile homes? We find that certain of the poorer areas, when you go through the northern tier in Pennsylvania, the northeast section and the west of Pittsburgh, with the exclusion of Pittsburgh, you find more and more mobile homes scattered across the landside than ever before. How can we improve them? Well, number 1, we could use yard size requirements. If you want a mobile home on your property, you have to set aside so much land. We could establish yard size requirements. We can require shrubbery and trees. If we want other mobile home developments, we can require tie-downs. Tie-downs are steel cables that are affixed to the bottom of the trailer and anchored in concrete. The tie-downs will help make the mobile homes far more stable. You can require skirting. This is sort of outdoor paneling that goes underneath the mobile home, and it encloses the underneath so people can't see underneath the mobile home. And lastly, mobile home development improvements can also include not just yard size requirements, shrubberies and trees, tie-downs, skirting, but also recreational areas in a mobile home park. That's always good, particularly for kids. What are alternatives to zoning? Well, there are few. But one of the alternatives to zoning would be, for example, just the free market forces. And you find this in Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas has not had zoning from the beginning, and they've always relied on the marketplace. What is another alternative to zoning? 1 is market forces. 2 is private restrictive covenants. Number 3 is possessing just a limited number of public land use ordinances, a limited number of public land use ordinances, subdivision regulations, building codes, housing codes, off-street parking ordinances, and you find that it also requires that, so a limited number of public land use ordinances have subdivision regulations, building codes, housing codes, off-street parking ordinances, and separate mobile home and township codes. Lastly, the fourth and final alternative to zoning, other than market forces, private restrictive covenants, and a limited number of public land use ordinances, is a discretionary review. A discretionary review is another alternative to zoning. And that will finish our discussion of land use. I want you to be very careful as you read through this and be sure that you understand anything. If you don't understand everything, please give me a call. I'm happy to talk to you anytime, 9 to 9, Monday through Friday, okay? All right, well, we'll close this